This is Move the Needle with Rob Kaplan, where we talk to people who lead, innovate, and inspire.
I thought people went door to door and put up yard signs in the fall. I thought everybody's dad got voted on, whether they were continuing their job or losing their job. And that became a very familiar rhythm in my household.
Today on Move the Needle, Rob talks with former Kansas Governor and Health and Human Services Secretary Kathleen Sebelius, who literally has spent her entire life in and around politics.
I first met Kathleen Sebelius in the early 2000s. She was the governor of Kansas. She was a very successful governor. I was introduced to her through mutual friends. I came and visited her at the State House in Kansas, and I remember she served tea and cookies to me as if I were meeting at her house. No aides were involved. She did it all herself. And I was just struck how down to earth she was and how grounded a person she was for being the governor of a state. Subsequent to that meeting, she asked me whether I would join the Kansas Healthcare Policy Authority, which was a 7-person bipartisan group that was tasked with examining the healthcare policy and practices for the state of Kansas. You've always been someone I've greatly admired as a public servant, but also a leader in our country. And so I'm thrilled to have you here today.
Thanks, Rob. Always good to talk to you. And we have known each other for decades.
You grew up in Ohio, and I think you may want to talk a little about your father was a business person, but ultimately, after you were already gone to college and later on, he became governor of Ohio. You might talk about what was the experience of growing up as the daughter of a governor.
Well, actually, his background, his father was the business person. My dad never was really very enthusiastic about business. And so disappointed his father kind of early in his career by becoming a teacher, which my grandfather did not think was a great profession for a guy with 4 kids. And then when I was 5, my dad actually ran for political office for the first time. So he served in city council. He then was a member of Congress. He then ran for governor. So most of my growing up time, my dad was actually in and running for various political offices. And that's sort of what I thought every family did. I thought people went door to door and put up yard signs in the fall. I thought, everybody's dad got voted on, whether they were continuing their job or losing their job. And so that became a very familiar rhythm in my household. He was not elected governor until actually I was in college and out of college, but I had been involved on his campaigns and working in elections for most of my life. And so it was a very familiar rhythm to me. I didn't really grow up as the daughter of a governor, but I certainly grew up as the daughter of a politician.
And what brought you to the state of Kansas?
I married a Kansan. I went to college in Washington, stayed in DC, and worked a bit after college. And my husband, Gary Sebelius, was the son of a Kansas congressman of a different political party. Gary's dad was a Republican. My dad was a Democrat. But when I met Gary, he was at Georgetown Law School. And when he graduated from law school, he came back to Kansas and practiced law. And about 6 months later, we got married and I came to Kansas with him.
Did you think at that point that you were going to do something related to public service?
Well, I always thought I would be involved in some kind of public service, not necessarily as a candidate, but we were brought up in a house where both my parents strongly believed in social justice missions, believed that those of us who had resources and assets needed to find a way to give back. So volunteer jobs and figuring out ways that we could be involved in community projects were really a part of my virtues and values that were given to me by my parents. So when I came to Kansas, I quickly found the Democratic Party because I really didn't know anybody in Kansas except my husband. I didn't have friends here. I didn't have a job here. and there was a small but kind of mighty Democratic Party group. And I just really became involved in politics as a volunteer, mostly to find some like minded people. But I didn't ever at that point see myself as a candidate. I just thought I would be helping other people get elected to office and working on campaigns.
In, I think, 1987, you, and 86, 87, you ran for the Kansas House of Representatives, where you stayed until the mid 90s. What
Right.
what caused you to run for office, run for the House in Kansas?
Well, I was the director of the trial lawyers. I lobbied in the Capitol on their behalf, so I was very familiar with the legislative rhythm. We lived in Topeka, which is the capital city. During that time, I had two children, and the woman who was our state representative, who lived around the corner from me, came to me and said, "I'm not going to run again. You should think about running." What was really appealing about that idea was that, as I say, my kids were 2 and 5. My husband was very busy in and out of trials. And frankly, I was really busy, and the wheels were kind of coming off the wagon at home. We were both traveling and busy with our work jobs. The Kansas legislature is a part time legislator,
Right.
and very busy for about 4 months in the winter, and then periodic committees during the rest of the year. And since I lived in the capital city, that seemed to me to be a very attractive option to do something I knew about. I liked the legislature. I liked the policy at the state level, but it also was an opportunity to spend a whole lot more time at home. And ironically, Rob, when some people look at my resume, they say, "Oh, you ran for the legislature in order to be governor." In many ways, I ran for the legislature to come home.
And did you always think that you would do something more in state government?
No.
You thought that would
um,
be the end of it.
well, I didn't really know. I knew what being a governor was like because my dad had been governor, and I thought that would be pretty terrific. What
Yeah.
I knew from the outset when I started to run is I really didn't have a big desire to go to Washington. I had
Right.
been in Washington, lived in Washington. My father had been in Congress. Gary's dad had been in Congress. That wasn't a goal of mine. So I think I was always focused. If I did something else, it would be at the state level. It both meant a balance of home life that made a lot of sense to me, but I also liked the policies at the state level. I like being involved in education and healthcare. I wasn't really interested at the city level in fixing potholes and, providing city services. Well, I thought that was important. That isn't what attracted me to government, but I liked the range of issues that you could deal with at the state level. And I really liked a base of operation being in Kansas.
And then what led you into becoming Kansas Insurance Commissioner, which you did from 1995 to 2003? How did you come to like a run for that job and then take that job?
Well, that was the craziest race I've ever run.
Your cheat and heart will tell on you.
This is the Ron Todd story, as told by newspapers all across Kansas. It's a story of fraud, deception, and abuse of public trust. Let's end this shameful chapter of Kansas politics. Elect Kathleen Sebelius, an insurance commissioner you can trust.
I didn't know a lot about the insurance commissioner's office because in Kansas, that office had never been held by a Democrat and
Uh,
ever in the history of the state. But I figured it had to have something to do with health insurance. There were a whole lot of people who thought I had really lost my mind because it seemed like a very daunting task. I'd never run statewide. No Democrat had ever won the office. I didn't really know a whole lot about what the office did.
and why had no Democrat ever won the office?
It was a Republican stronghold. And frankly, the Republicans who had been in office in that particular office were financed by the insurance industry that they
Ah,
regulated
I see.
and had lots of resources. So for 50 years, there had been some incumbent Republican who was well known, well financed by the insurance industry. And it really was not seen as a viable office for any Democrat to try and run for. I kind of thought, well, one of the things that I thought could happen was to begin to try and, if we could get enough money, if I could raise enough money to get some sort of public message out. I thought most Kansans wouldn't like the fact that the insurance commissioner actually kind of worked for the industry and not for them. You could run as a consumer champion.
So then we get now into the early 2000s, and this is when you decided to run for governor. What went into that decision, and what was it like to go from being insurance commissioner to running for governor and then becoming governor?
So I had served 2 terms as insurance commissioner, and the governor at the time was a Republican named Bill Graves, and he and I actually worked pretty closely together. Although we were different parties, we had a lot of similar interests, and he had me set up the children's insurance program in Kansas. Even though it was under the jurisdiction of the governor, he said, I think it more appropriately should be in your office. And we were pretty close colleagues. He had served also 2 terms as governor. And so in 2002, there was going to be an open seat for governor, which meant both the Republicans would have to field a nominee and the Democrats. So that was kind of attractive to me. I also had a big decision as insurance commissioner, which kind of led to the next step, which was that a major national insurance company, Anthem Insurance, wanted to take over Kansas Blue Cross Blue Shield, the health insurance company. And Kansas Blue Cross Blue Shield had a market share of about 60% of Kansans had their policies through Blue Cross and Blue Shield. And I instinctively felt this was not going to be a good idea for Kansas, but it became a real battle where the insurance company was determined to do this. Their board had voted to go ahead. There was a provision in the law that said the insurance commissioner had an opportunity to look at the decision and make a decision, go or no go, on behalf of the state. And what I decided to do was hold a series of hearings across the state of Kansas. What I knew, Rob, at that point, having done this before when I ran for insurance commissioner and other times, is you needed to get the people of Kansas kind of involved and engaged. You needed to let them know what was going on. So we started in Western Kansas and held about 6 hearings, inviting the public, inviting doctors, inviting hospitals, inviting others to come. But what became very clear was once Kansans began to understand what this might possibly mean, that they would no longer have a Kansas board of directors, that they'd be under some big umbrella with a big company, that there would be much less opportunity to have decisions made about what was good for the state or not good for the state, that we would be a small piece of this giant company.
Yeah.
There began to be a groundswell. So by the time we got to the hearing in Topeka, there were about 1,000 people who had showed up. And it was clear that there was some significant momentum. I ultimately turned down the merger. I was sued in court. The court upheld my authority as insurance commissioner to make this decision. And I then, over the course of those months, I hadn't made the absolute decision to run for governor, but I decided, okay, this is something I need to do. So I announced the Blue Cross decision and announced for governor.
And I gather this experience, did it give you more confidence or gave you more conviction that being governor, you could really make a difference?
It did. I think it really helped. It also helped to my race for governor was, again, made a whole lot easier by the fact that I had run twice statewide, contacts all over Kansas. I'd had to raise money all over Kansas, but also people knew my work. So it wasn't coming out of a legislative district in one part of the state. I really had a statewide base, and that made the run for governor a whole lot easier.
Kansas has had over the years, I remember over my lifetime, it's had occasionally a Democratic governor, but it's widely known as a quote unquote red state. What's it like to run for governor and then get elected governor of a red state? And you mentioned you had just held a job for 8 years that had been predominantly held by Republicans in the past.
Well, you learn early on how to put together a coalition, first of voters who will vote for you. So even if you run for office as a Democrat, if you get 100% of the Democrats to vote for you, you lose. You must put together a coalition of people who then come together not because of their party registration, but because of their views or beliefs. So that's a challenge. I always had a majority Republican legislator as a governor. So
Right.
again, doing my job required putting together people, and it wasn't always the same people. I could reliably count on Democratic votes from Democratic legislators, but I always had to find some Republicans. And it was an issue by issue. People were with me on one issue and then they may flip on another issue, but it causes, I think, as a member of the executive branch, you count votes, you know what people care about, you know what their districts are like, it requires some cajoling and convincing and coalition building
Yeah.
as really a daily exercise.
One of the things I noticed about you over the years, you have the ability to disagree with people, but to maintain the relationship with them. How did you learn to do that, and how did you use that skill?
Well, I would say that growing up, watching my dad, he was brilliant as a speaker and he had incredible ideas about, where the state of Ohio should be and how um, he could work to improve their lives. He really did not like retail politics. He didn't like, shaking hands with folks and he felt it was almost intrusive to go up and, engage with people one on one. He was much more comfortable at a distance. My father in law, on the other hand, had these incredible people skills. If you met him once, he would remember 5 years later
Hmm.
where you met him, the name of your spouse and your kids, he had this incredible one on one people. He had a very difficult time, though, relating, to his children. He was always looking over their shoulder for the next person. He was ready to dive into a crowd. So both of them had really interesting skills and some really interesting flaws. And I think that was very helpful to me to make observations. I like people on a regular basis. I actually used to love campaigning. I loved door to door stuff just because it was the most interesting poll I would ever take. And I think just all of those skills, I really loved policy. I loved to get things done, but I also was pretty pragmatic about if you can't move, you can't throw a 30-yard pass, then, can you make a first down running 3 plays? I was always looking how to get down the field in a way that made progress and was true to my values, but it wasn't ever an all or nothing proposition. And I think that was very helpful.
Uh, And I know as governor, you were very focused on the economy, on education, and particular access to healthcare, particularly affordable healthcare. How did you pick your priorities, and how did you use the strategies you just described to make progress in those areas?
Well, I had a friend who was a governor at the same time I was, and he used to have an expression that, state government is really easy to understand. We educate, we medicate, we incarcerate, and other than that, everything else is chump change. And it's very true. That's how state budgets are organized. But also in Kansas, Rob, what we found out very early on is that the issues that were very personal to people that allow them, give them permission, compel them to cross party lines are those issues. So, education funding whether they were Republicans or independents, the vast majority of Kansans believe that tax dollars spent on education is a good thing. And that was a way to delineate my views from whatever my Republican opponent would say. Healthcare is another very personal issue, which is broadly supported by Kansans. Turns out that, where you need to spend resources, time, and energy, also expansion of healthcare and funding of education were key issues that allowed people and compelled people to cross party lines. And then
Right.
economic development is a must, because none of this works unless you have a prosperous state, unless you have businesses who feel they have a environment that works, and a regulatory framework that works in the state, and hopefully a chief executive who wants them to do well and do successfully. So those things kind of keep the engine running.
You were ranked in 2005 by Time Magazine as one of the nation's top 5 governors. If you were giving advice, and I think you've already given some of it in your comments, if you're giving advice to another governor, what makes a great governor?
It starts with having really talented people around you who know a lot more than you do in very specific subject areas. So, a great Secretary of Transportation, an economic development office that is looking statewide and globally, an education commissioner who knows, and then letting them do their jobs, empowering
Right.
them, but really encouraging them. And then trying to focus time and energy on what uniquely you can do as the chief executive. So spending a lot of time in the state, working not only business leaders, but I used to do a lot of visits in areas where a legislator was saying to his or her constituents, I really support education, and yet coming to the Capitol and voting against bills every time. So I would go and just kind of do a little Rotary Club in that district and say,
Huh.
interestingly enough, that isn't exactly what's going on. I mean, so those kinds of things that
Yeah.
you're using the platform of the office to really drive initiatives and policies, and then telling people on a regular basis why you're doing what you're doing, how it's improving their lives, how it's improving the state.
But I was always impressed how practical she was, non ideological, but in particular, how in touch she was with what was going on at the ground level in the state of Kansas, and how much of a real person she was.
Kansas Governor Kathleen Sebelius is Barack Obama's choice for Secretary of Health and Human Services. That's according to a White House source who says the president will formally announce the nomination Monday. Sebelius was an early supporter of Obama out on the campaign trail, and she was a top surrogate to women's groups.
Was that a hard decision?
Well, I had a sort of interesting path to get to the cabinet. So I was very enthusiastic about Barack Obama as a presidential candidate. Early on, I was one of the very early governors to endorse him and had campaigned for him. And he very quickly, once he was elected, asked me to come to Washington. I need you there. I want you there. He had also designated Tom Daschle, former U.S. Senator Tom Daschle, who had played a key role in his campaigns and been very close to him. He designated Tom Daschle as the Secretary of HHS. And as you say, I had 2 years left in my governor's term. And as I looked at the possibility of leaving the governor's office and taking a cabinet position, and he made it very clear, basically I could do whatever domestic position I wanted, with the exception of HHS. So I said no. I asked him to take my name out of the mix for cabinet offices, said I'll be happy to be in Kansas. And I said to him, look, you're, happy to work with you on the ground. When I finish my governor's term in 2010, I think you will be successful. I think you're going to be reelected. You're going to need some people on your second team. So, count me in. Fast forward 2 months, Tom Daschle ended up dropping out as a nominee.
Yeah. I remember.
And the president came back to me and said, okay, if I offered you this job, would you take this job? And I said yes, because I just knew he had said in his announcement speech that he wanted to work on a major health bill. This was something that I had spent a lot of time in the legislature as insurance commissioner, as governor, worked on health policy, health reform, trying to expand health access. And I thought this is an opportunity and a possibility that I just can't pass up.
So then we get into, we'll talk about a couple of episodes. First, the Affordable Care Act and the effort to pass the Affordable Care Act. What did you learn from that very contentious, very partisan debate?
Well, it was a really interesting exercise because it was quite different than the experience I'd had in Kansas, where at the end of the day, you really could put together a coalition of people on a bipartisan basis. Newly elected President Obama had a big majority in the House of Representatives and had, I think, 56 Democratic senators. So he had enough Democrats to pass a bill with Democrats only. He wanted very much to have a bipartisan bill, and there were hundreds of hearings and tons of amendments along the way. It actually was, in context, a pretty rapid process. It was about 15 months from his swearing in date until the time he had a bill on his desk. So to pass a major health reform bill when 70 years of presidents had failed to do that was pretty remarkable. On the other hand, we could not get a single Republican at the end of the day to vote to be part of this legislation, even though many of them suggested dozens of amendments, which were throughout the bill. So I watched what was a pretty remarkable coming together, both of Democrats on one hand, who said, all right, we're going to pass this, even if it's only Democrats only. This is a shot at something we've believed in and worked on for a very long time. And I watched a coalition and then a consensus build in Republicans, where one of their organizing principles, I would say from March of 2010, which is when the president signed this bill, was opposing health reform.
So why do you think the Republicans, as you were sitting there, why do you think they made that decision? And is there, in hindsight, anything that could have been done to have brought them on board, do you think now?
Well, Rob, it's a question I've thought about a lot. I think that one of the most clear statements was made early in this battle by then Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, who said, my number one job is to make sure that President Obama does not have a second term in office.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
he made that declaration about 4 months into Obama's presidency. And what they knew was that two things, I would say, by the Republicans. One was this was President Obama's number one priority. And so trying to make sure it didn't pass, trying to make sure, even if it passed, that it failed and was never implemented was important to them. But also an underlying knowledge that if ever this bill, this framework were to go forward, it would be very difficult to take it away from people. Looking back, we did pauses in the Senate. We were optimistic that there would be some opportunity in the Senate to have people come aboard. And there were, then Senator Olympia Snowe and Senator Susan Collins and others who, spent a lot of time in committees offering amendments and whatever else. I don't know what differently could have been done, because at the end of the day, they basically had a party line, you either are with us or against us kind of bright line in the sand. And I would have loved to have had a Republican or two vote for it, but boy, we could not figure out. I think President Obama would have mowed their grass or driven their carpools or done anything, but we could not crack that caucus.
But I get the sense, even today, knowing Kathleen, that she likes being in touch with people on the ground and being able to take action to help solve problems when she sees them.
Let's shift gears now, and let's start with you obviously must have had coaches and mentors through your career. Who were some of the great coaches and mentors that were very instrumental in your leadership?
Well, I certainly go back to my upbringing in my family. I was in an all girls school from the time I was in kindergarten through really through college. And that was pretty unusual for a woman my age raised in the 50s and 60s
Hmm.
because I was taught from a very early age that girls could do everything. We
Hmm.
were the ballerinas and the jocks. We were the smartest in the class and the dumbest in the class, but you didn't have preset rules about what girls could do and what they couldn't do. That framework for me was extraordinarily helpful. So that sort of informed my life view. I would say my father and mother, but particularly my father, reinforced that I could and should do anything I wanted to do, and he would be very supportive of that. Not necessarily going to politics, but just this sense that I shouldn't be limited by what people were saying at the time was appropriate for women. That, anything I wanted to do, I was smart enough and talented enough and should not have barriers. That's a very unusual message to have been given as a girl, as I say, in the 50s and early 60s. I by happenstance had a very smart woman lawyer who was part of one of these early criminal justice groups when I got out of college. I mean, I had some great teachers in college and those messages were reinforced, but I would say the next key mentor was this woman who ran the small association I worked for and taught me very practical things, how to write. She'd say, can you write a grant? No. Well, I'll teach you how to write a grant. Can you do this? No. But she wasn't rejecting my lack of skills. She was really mentoring me in a very practical way. When I got to the corrections department in Kansas, to say it was a hostile environment is really an understatement. There were a whole lot of guys there who really felt it was totally inappropriate to have a young woman who was working in this atmosphere. The secretary of corrections at the time, the guy who ran the agency, was a real champion for me. And his secretary, his real life secretary, turned out to be the most knowledgeable person in the whole department. And she taught me a lot about organizations and offices and how to survive in a hostile environment. And then there were women along the way. I mean, I've had a chance to have some amazing women mentors and leaders. When I first thought about running for governor, Ann Richards, the former governor of Texas, was kind of the godmother to those of us who were young, maybe governors, and taught us a lot and was involved personally in campaigns. There were people here in Kansas who knew politics inside out. So I've been really fortunate not to have people who had done exactly what I wanted to do, but who had skills and abilities and talents and expertise that I've just been delighted to take advantage of or hire them or befriend them I think one of the things, Rob, that I've learned along the way is it's really helpful to know what it is that you do well and then be very candid about what it is that you don't do so well and
Yes.
find people who do those things and not
Interesting.
fight with them, not compete with them, but actually bring them in and have them teach you
Get
or
their
have
help.
them do it for you, or you bet it
That's
makes.
great. If you look back, I've certainly had made my share a number of mistakes and say, boy, I'd like a do-over or this or that. What do you look back on and say, gee, wish I could have a do-over on that one? Or my Lord, I can't believe I did that. I wish I could do that differently now.
Well, I'd say in very practical terms, I mean, back to our conversation about the Affordable Care Act, I keep thinking if I had been, more engaged, more sensitive, more thoughtful, maybe there could have been a more bipartisan effort. if I had known it was going to be passed only by Democrats, it would be also a much different bill. We would have made it
Yeah.
much more progressive.
Yeah,
And
that's
there
a good
are
point.
still things being fixed. We made it the way it was to try and attract Republican votes, but having not attracted, I wish I could have gone back and redone the whole damn
Yeah,
bill.
well, that's really interesting. That's really interesting.
So it works kind of both ways. I made some pretty stupid votes when I was a legislator because I wasn't thinking of the votes in bigger context. Not votes that I regret. I feel proud that I did not ever violate what I had as a pretty clear moral code. And in spite of people saying, oh, this is really going to be bad for you and they're going to come after you for the, I just felt I didn't care. But some of the things that I ended up being involved in were pretty stupid and kind of bad policy. And I just should have been smarter. And the final thing I tried, but I didn't spend enough time, I would say, mentoring. I mean, one of the things I really believe in is that any woman, particularly who gets to an office, a position, has to spend a lot of time and energy pulling people up around her. And I did that in every office that I held and in every position I held, but I wish I had done more of it because I look around and there are these incredibly talented folks who just need one shot. They need
Yeah.
one person to pay attention. And I should have spent more time doing that.
So I've watched you be a very effective coach and mentor, including currently. I observe it now. What advice would you give to younger people listening to this podcast who want to make a positive impact in the world, build their careers, want to be women who want to be leaders and develop their leadership?
Women, I think, particularly younger women, to have a sense of risk taking
Right.
is really, really important. And I don't mean jump off the building kind of risk. I mean,
Put
being
yourself out
willing,
there.
you bet, put yourself out, ask for help, apply for a job that's a stretch goal, because if you don't ever apply, you're never going to get it. You never know if you can stretch. Look around as you feel yourself to be not sufficient to do any task or job. Look around at who's doing it and reevaluate. I used to do that with some of the jobs I would be looking at and think, how hard could this be? Look at who's got these positions right now. I mean, I can do that. So I do think there's a risk-taking element. And then I think find somebody who really believes in you. Find somebody who is doing what you think you might want to do or has a skill that you think you might want to have, and ask them for help. I mean, at the worst, they are just flattered and say, I don't have enough time, but you're never going to insult anybody by
Nope.
saying, I'd love you to teach me this. I'd love your help doing this.
Kathleen Sebelius, Governor, Secretary, thank you for your service and thank you for your leadership. It's been a pleasure talking with you today.
Great to visit with you, Rob. Thank you for what you have done over your career. And thank you for being a helper and supporter. You are one of the people who adopted me early on, and that makes a difference.
It's
So
been a
thank you.
pleasure. Pleasure and an honor.
Next time on Move the Needle with Rob Kaplan.
So what was the cost of more notoriety, higher profile?
The cost is, it puts pressure on the culture, ethos, standard, the why we serve.
Rob talks with retired Admiral Wyman Howard, who led the Navy SEALs through an amazing era of growth and change after 9/11. That's on the next Move the Needle with Rob Kaplan. Move the Needle with Rob Kaplan is produced and edited by Sam Zeff and Scott Richardson, and I'm executive producer Renelle Golden. We want to thank Michelle Brown and Zorik's team from Hello Studios for help with production and logistics. Do not forget to subscribe to Move the Needle wherever you get your podcasts and to Rob's YouTube channel. Until next time, this was Move the Needle with Rob Kaplan.